everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of The Coalition. My name is Angie.
And my name is Faith. Together we are two best friends who pretty much just love arguing about everything. I happen to fall on the left side of politics, at least relative to Angie.
Yes, which is very true because I find myself in the centre right of the political spectrum. And so basically the entire point of our YouTube channel is to try and get other people to engage in conversation with those they would often disagree with.
Today's topic is one that concerns many of us in Australia as of late, and that is whether to change Australia Day from the 26th of January to another date with regards to the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in history and today. I will be arguing that the date should absolutely be changed, given it represents British invasion and the genocide of Aboriginals. Whereas Angie...
Yeah, well, as for me, I'm going to be expressing why Australia Day should absolutely be celebrated on January 26th and go over a couple of key historical elements that people often overlook when they come to this discussion. Before we jump into all of that, let's start with a more detailed overview of why changing the date of Australia Day is so contentious. One thing that's important to note is that when the British first came to Australia, it was already inhabited by an Indigenous population, and that was that of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And there is pretty much widespread belief that they'd been around in Australia for at least 50,000 years before the arrival of the Europeans.
This population consisted of over 500 different nations and possibly the same number of languages.
So that's why it's important to note that there wasn't just one unified Aboriginal population per se. You look at a map of Australia and it was a mosaic of different nations.
A lot of the culture is and was conveyed through a rich history of storytelling and art and oral tradition.
But also another interesting factor that's worth pointing out is that the English weren't the first Europeans to come to Australia. In fact, that was credited towards the Dutch. The Dutch arrived in 1606 and they landed on the west coast of Cape York.
April 1770, Captain James Cook and associates landed at Botany Bay, which is now modern New South Wales, and claimed the coast for England. This was the start of genocide.
Having realised that they needed a new penal colony or a settlement overseas to basically dump convicts or prisoners, they decided that Australia was going to be their new destination.
This leads to the events of 1787, in which the first fleet of 11 ships under Governor Arthur Phillip departed from England and set sail for good old Aussie town.
And that's why they arrived here the following year in January. They first arrived at Botany Bay, but Governor Phillip thought the location really wasn't suitable for the new colony, and that's why he decided a few days later to head to Port Jackson. And hence on 26th of January 1788, Port Jackson was established for the British as their new establishment down under.
Hence, 1,030 people came ashore, including 736 convicts, proving that Australia was indeed founded on British crime. Australia was eventually constituted as a nation on January 1st, 1901. Oh, Federation. Following an act passed by British Parliament which involved the Federation of the 6 states coming together as one.
But there's still a little bit of tension with regards to the Aboriginal population. For instance, issues such as health and education are usually main points of concern where the Indigenous populations feel that they're being underrepresented or not benefited enough.
To bring you up to speed, many federal councils are changing their official celebrations to other dates that are not January 26th.
This is because a lot of people who are Aboriginal, and including some non-Aboriginal people, do believe that January 26th represents an invasion rather than a date which should be celebrated.
And with that, let's launch into debate.
It's time to jump into the debate of whether the date of Australia Day should be changed from January 26th. Faith, over to you.
Well, first of all, the date of Australia Day has always been quite controversial. I believe that from a logical perspective, it doesn't make any sense to celebrate Australia Day on 26th because it is celebrating a national holiday of a very multicultural nation from a historical event as a sort of launch point that is only really significant to one group of people, and that is white Australians, specifically Europeans actually, not even other whites. Culturally, the meaning of Australia Day should be much more inclusive and it aimed at not only the variety of immigrants we've had come into the country, but also our First Nation peoples. Angie?
See, what my response would be to that argument is that, in actual fact, it is actually culturally relevant to all people in Australia, regardless of their ethnic background or their race. And that's because, at least from an official perspective, the values that Australia was founded upon, even in 1788, were values that are still very prominent today. So, for instance, equality under the law, democratic traditions. Even slavery was pretty much abolished right from the get-go. From another perspective, you compare to American Independence Day, that's only relevant to 1/3 of their population because it led to the overthrowing of British colonial power, but it also led to a civil war, I believe.
But wouldn't you say that Australia Day is more tied to the events then of Federation rather than, let's say, the day that some white guy decided to land on the coast and start making life annoying for a bunch of Aboriginal people? So therefore, why not celebrate Australia Day on January 1st? I mean, apart from the obvious clashes with New Year, but like just from a purely technical perspective, isn't that a more representative day of what it means to be Australian?
I mean, I guess, but I think, like you said, it's more of a technical than of like moral significance in the sense that you look at the values that were enshrined in King George III's orders to Governor Phillip. You look at the different statements that Governor Phillip made. Those moral values that were enshrined quite early on were more relevant to the events of 1788 than in 1901.
Good points there, but wouldn't you say that Australia Day is kind of morally pro-genocide and at least pro-colonial? Because Europeans came to Australia, ostensibly invaded, and took the land and enslaved the people for themselves. Isn't having a national holiday which is celebrated on a day which many First Nations people associate with genocide, cultural erasure, war, all sorts of negative cultural consequences, wouldn't you say that that's quite a negative way to have a holiday? I mean, why would you want to celebrate something on a day that's so awful for so many people?
So one little event that I would probably refer to is the Mile Creek Massacre, and that was something that occurred in 1838. It's pretty disgusting. Basically, there were a group of, I believe they were farmers, who were a little bit antagonised by having to share the land with Aboriginals. They weren't too keen on having Aboriginal people on their property, and so it led to, I think, I haven't got the numbers off the top of my head, led to a really awful amount of violence. What you have to recognise is, why did they decide to cover it up? And the reason was because they knew they weren't going to get away with it. So they recognised that they were going to be caught and they were going to be prosecuted if the authorities found out about it, which is why they decided, presumably, to cover up the crime. Now what that again shows is that on an official level, the Europeans weren't coming, at least intentionally, as an invasion force. They were coming here as to try and set up a colony and try to find wherever they could peace with the population already existing. Undone, I rest my case.
That's a pretty good counterpoint, but here's my last argument. So, the issue with Australia Day, despite what some angry internet commentators might have to say on the issue, isn't actually a recent argument. In fact, there's recorded evidence going back as far as early White Australia days that there was a lot of opposition to Australia Day being on January 26th for pretty much the same reasons that are around today. Given this and the fact that with this issue coming up again and again in Australia, you know, with a lot of contentious debate, what's to say it won't eventually be changed? And if so, why fight it?
This is when I would pretty much get my big old conservative hat on and say, just because it's been going on for a while doesn't mean we have to change it. I don't want to say particularly why it would be so relevant to suggest that just because something is a long-running argument doesn't make it a good one. Even the fact that January 26th is Australia's National Day, it really does speak to our good fortune. We haven't had a revolution to mark. We haven't had any particularly antagonistic civil war that's really worth celebrating. In fact, from a European perspective, our history is pretty much so mild we haven't got many dates to choose from.
Well, Angie, what about National Sorry Day and Labour Day? There's a bunch of holidays that are culturally relevant in Australia. Let's say we just assign Australia Day to a random date to solve things. Wouldn't that make more sense than celebrating a day of cruelty and racism?
Because you can't guarantee that any of these other dates that you pick didn't mark some level of violence.
It's quite difficult, I think, for a government body to pick a particular day for national celebration. Some people regard it as a big deal, and I think for a lot of people it would be seen as an unnecessary change. The problem is, Angie, I just don't know that sits well with me. I don't think it's that hard to find a date. Like, whatever that date may be, I'm sure voters of Australia are quite keen to be inclusive to all, and that includes immigrants from non-European backgrounds as well as our First Nations peoples. Let's find a date where we can all be happy.
Anzac Day is also another potential date. The problem that I have with these dates is that they're not really dates for celebrating Australia, if that makes they're not really appropriate dates for celebration. They're dates for remembrance and acknowledgement.
Yeah, they're dates for remorse. I don't think they're a great date to necessarily throw a barbecue and invite your mates around.
Yeah,
That's
and
the
wave
problem.
a national flag.
Yeah, and again, they're both tied to very specific cultural events. One being a horrible incident, horrible mistreatment of Aboriginal children. Anzac Day is very tied to World War I and the loss of thousands of soldiers in Gallipoli. And I think both those dates are hardly the sort of party dates that we want Australia Day to be. So ultimately, the practical solution of trying to find a good day for Australia Day hasn't yet been solved. But hey, I think any day would be better than the 26th, you know? Like, just pick a day. It's not that hard, you know? Maybe move it a bit out from January, because January is always an awkward time of the year. Who really wants a barbecue in January? Put it in February somewhere. I feel like that would be more fun.
That's an interesting point where we both agree on, is that changing the date of Australia Day to other already culturally significant national holidays, such as Anzac Day or National Sorrow Day, would be inappropriate. Whether the date will ever be changed, I'm obviously of the belief it should not be, and hope that it never is.
And I sincerely hope that we find a solution that is more inclusive of everyone in order to get the date changed to something that doesn't cause any problems for anyone, so we can all have a good time, nice barbecue, nice pool party, catch up with mates, and enjoy Australia Day.
I think that one's almost impossible, but as always we're going to say on this channel, we must agree to disagree. We will see you on the next episode of The Coalition.
Thank you for listening.
People will listen to our
I said
voice.
Australia.
Oh, you didn't. You just went straight to Australia Day.
Well, look, it's an
And
Australia
people
Day. It's
listen-
clearly
If
Australia.
assholes listen to us, they think that we're English, so we should
Shit.
probably...
Today's...
Can you just look at the camera? So one thing important to note is that when the British, starting, I'm going to read this and then I'm going to say it. William Jance.
William Jance! So, April 1770, James Cook, Captain James Cook.
Oh, this goes so badly! This is serious. Dignified.
Ow! Stop hitting me!
Okay, that was quite hard. I'm sorry. Well, I mean, this is where I'm going to get my big old conservative hat on and say, just because
Hang on,
everyone's
I
not.
found your conservative hat. It's a donut.
I can't wait for the outtakes.
Wait, hang on.
anyway.
It's a donut.
Yeah.
And on that point, Angie, agree to disagree?
Yeah.
Hey, you put your hand in front of my face.
Oh,
do it.
I'm sorry. Let's do that again. 1, 2, 3.
Kaboom!
Kaboom! Let's just do a nice raised eyebrows.
What is life? What is Australia Day? That's such a weird noise. You have to duck as you're shot.